Welcome to the 8th video in the series on detective fiction from the University of Greenwich English Programme. The video is associated with the third year core course, Literature and Publishing, which literature students all do and which is an option for others on some other degree programmes. It's from the part of that Literature and Publishing course that's concerned with the history of detective fiction. We started with 3 videos on Edgar Allan Poe's Murders in the Rue Morgue, followed by another 4 on the 1864 sensation novel Henry Dunbar by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. This now is the 5th video on Henry Dunbar. This video lecture in the series follows closely on the previous. Not only is it the 5th video on Henry Dunbar, but it continues the investigation that the 3rd video had started and the 4th continued on what is now a much quoted, even a notorious denunciation of sensation fiction by an Oxford Don, Henry Longville Mansell. We've already explored what sensation was: sensation sermons, spasmodic poetry, the effects of serial publication, the effects of travelling by railways and wanting to buy sensational material at railway bookstores, material that keeps the purchaser mildly anxious in order to distract them from their real anxieties of continuous modernity and continuous movement. We've looked at the effects of publishing of the circulating libraries, and also the synergies of publishing with the theatre, each cross-promoting the other. In this video, I want to turn to Mansell's next accusation against sensation fiction, that it was formulaic. Now, he doesn't use this word, it's a more recent term, but there really is much the same as what Mansell is describing. We think of formula fiction today as connected to Harlequin romances, perhaps, but it's only ever used in ways that are intended to make whoever describes the text as formulaic appear culturally superior to what they're describing. The idea of fiction by numbers, to use another metaphor, has been around a very long time. Formula fiction implies a kind of chemistry. As anyone who's ever played with a chemistry set will know, you add various chemicals in order to create certain new chemicals or effects. And the choice of chemicals is, of course, the formula. It's a scientific idea and has all the power of science behind its diagnostic associations and promises. We'll be exploring some of those promises and also, I think more importantly, alternative formulations of the idea of the formula in the video that follows. Now, when Mansell comes to talk about what we're calling the formulaic, he doesn't use a chemical analogy. Instead, he takes up the discourses of art and refers to a lay figure. Now, a lay figure was, and still is, a kind of model with articulated joints that, in theory anyway, are only supposed to move in the ways humans can. The one I've got, a very cheap one, moves in all sorts of ways. We can think of mannequins with movable limbs, such as we see in shops today. These are really the modern equivalents of lay figures. Now, artists would place lay figures in various poses in order to draw from them. Lay figures usually don't have faces, though expensive ones did, always sexually ambiguous ones though, as the lay figures almost never had pronounced features that differentiated between the sexes. Differentiation between the sexes was left to the clothes that artists draped upon them. Mansell compares the characters in sensation fiction to these kinds of models, contrasting them with the living, breathing human beings that the kind of text he likes are supposedly depict. Sensation characters, then, are only imitations of life, not life itself. They may wear different clothes, but underneath they're all the same and wooden. Mansell goes on to describe sensation fiction characters as the simplest of contrasting types, as if they were not so much lay figures now, but pieces in a game of drafts, perhaps. Though here, given that some pieces in the game are different from others, perhaps Mansell, unlike Edgar Allan Poe in the introduction to the Murders in the Rue Morgue, is thinking of chess. But it's Mansell's reference to the algebraic equation that most closely approximates our modern notion of the formula. It seems he's referring to the kind of narrative that the kind of algebra that you see on the screen in front of you comprises. It's a puzzle algebra, not the fantastically complicated algebra of advanced mathematics. Now, Mansell was saying, of course, that sensation fiction is not original. It's all been heard and read before. Mary Braddon was perfectly aware of this. She had to write for money and had to write fast. In a novel that was being serialized in the same year that Henry Dunbar came out, The Doctor's Wife, Braddon has a wonderfully pragmatic character who is a sensation author in effect, if not in name. For as Braddon herself well knew, and as you too know now, after the previous videos on Henry Dunbar that you've watched, sensation was hardly a new phenomenon in the 1860s, when the supposed heyday of the sensation novel took place, at least according to conventional literary history. In fact, even by 1852, the date of the story of The Doctor's Wife, Braddon's character Sigismund writes sensation novels as automatically as the would-be gentleman talks prose in Molière's comedy Le Bourgeois Gentilhomme of 1670. Sigismund has 4 serials on the go, rather like Mary Braddon herself, in fact. And that means he doesn't have time to think up entirely original plots and ideas and characters. What he does is take ideas, plots, and characters from other people's works, combine them in new ways, et voila, he has a new novel. It sounds rather intertextual to me. Now, this seems exactly what Mansell was saying, but Sigismund uses the term garland. Now, garland is a literary term deriving from classical literature. Anthology means the same thing, and you're probably more familiar with that term than a garland. Anthos means flower, and logos means word, so an anthology is a literary bouquet. Sigismund's combination novel is a kind of anthology with the elements combined to make a harmonious composition. It's describing the same thing as Mansell, but in a different discourse. And that different discourse changes attitudes towards the thing described. It gives the thing described a new reality. It reframes that thing described. Now, while of course we're to see Sigismund as a comically self-aware figure, perhaps a painfully comic one, but we can also see that he's not only exposing what he does in writing combination novels, but he's also explaining why he has to do it, and he's re-inscribing the combination novel, the sensation novel, the popular novel. He's re-inscribing this kind of formula novel into a different discourse for the reader in order to make the reader think again about how they regard such fiction. So both Mansell and Braddon herself were saying that sensation fiction is not original. It's all been heard and read before. But what implications do such charges of lack and originality and individuality have for the concept of literary property, of copyright, that authors were still on and off fighting over the meaning of? For we can't forget the discourse of the law of which copyright's a part. Before we go on to think about what the elements of sensation formula might be, let's make a very quick detour into the thorny world of intellectual property. It's certainly not the time and place to explore the details of IP. Suffice it to say that in the 1860s, in theory, authors kept the copyright of what they wrote for the duration of their lives, or for 42 years, whichever were longer. An author's inheritors were able to keep the copyright for 7 years after the author's death too, provided those 7 years fell within the 42-year limit. However, in practice, most authors sold their copyrights to their publishers in return for a cash payment. The system of royalties was not yet very common. Now, the idea of original work that copyright depends on might be severely questioned if texts were considered formulaic. Who owns the intellectual property of the elements of a combination novel? Now, in 1863, the year before Henry Dunbar came out as a 3-volume novel, an author accused Mary Braddon of having copied a novel of his in her runaway success, Lady Audley's Secret. The magazine The Examiner went to great pains to point out all the similarities between Lady Audley's Secret and The Man of the World, and there are quite a few. I'm not going to give them to you here. However, the Examiner's conclusion was rather surprising. It completely agrees with Braddon's and with Mansell's conception of the formulaic nature of popular fiction, which it calls, by the term used at the time, kitchen literature, because servants were supposed to read it in the kitchen of the houses where they were employed. Since kitchen literature was made up of a common stock of incidents, then there can be no literary theft. The game this time is neither draughts nor chess, but a very Victorian toy, the kaleidoscope, that again reframes the same process and offers a different reality, a different way of conceiving the nature of the combination sensation novel. Not an algebraic formula, nor a garland of the brightest flowers of literature, not the discourses of the law and the theft of private property, but the discourse of harmless and decorative, aesthetic, domestic family games, using technology, of course. Now, finally, at last, let's turn to what the basic ingredients of the sensation novel cake may be, the flour, sugar, butter, and flavorings, so to speak, if you'll allow me to change discourse yet again. I've copied the recipe you can see on the screen from the Useful Victorian website. There's a lot more detail there that's well worth reading, and I urge you to go and have a look at it. Now, obviously, we're not going to find every ingredient in this list in Henry Dunbar. I think it's pretty obvious that disguise is central to the plot, though. It's not just Joseph Wilmot who disguises himself, but Margaret too. She becomes Betty the housemaid, and then Miss Wilson when she tries to hide away from Clement Austin towards the end. Now, one of the key passages for disguise motif shows how disguise brings with it a price. For you can disguise yourself, but you'll have to pay for it. In chapter 12, the lawyer Arthur Lovell explains to Henry Dunbar that a criminal necessarily punishes himself for a crime he commits. He feels what later psychologists will call paranoia. He's forced to be suspicious of everyone, to read everything and everyone suspiciously all the time. He also has to ensure that his reality is not read. The criminal must remain illegible. He has to keep guard upon his every look, his smallest word, his most trivial action. He knows men learned in the philosophy of crime let's call it criminology, though they didn't use the term at the time. He knows that these men treat people's behavior like books they've learned to read, books that to other people are incomprehensible. And then anyone might be a detective in disguise, something I'll return to in the next video. Disguise, as I've said, comes at a cost: paranoia. It brings its own punishment in the form of a terrible unease, which is so terrible that in the end the disguised criminal will give himself away, if only to stop the agony that his forced disguise brings him. Oh, how true is this? Margaret disguises herself to save her father and outwits the detective and gets away with it. She doesn't appear to suffer terrible anguish because of it. And in the end, Joseph Wilmot gets away with it too. He's never caught, but dies, if we believe Margaret, mentally punished by himself alone. As usual, if we read Arthur suspiciously, as we should read all of Braddon suspiciously, we can see that Arthur's view is trite and conventional, melodramatic. He's suspicious of the man he thinks is Henry Dunbar, and is trying to pressurize him to see if he can read signs of guilt in him by describing the signs of guilt. In other words, he's trying to make Henry Dunbar recognize himself in that description and so give himself away. But of course, Henry Dunbar doesn't give himself away. Things only go wrong when he meets the Major and Margaret. He doesn't give himself away simply because the people around him don't read him suspiciously enough, apart from Arthur, and Arthur doesn't pursue it. That's not to say that the character doesn't suffer, but it's not clear to me whether he suffers enough to redeem himself. He treats Margaret badly right to the end, whatever she says, for we should be suspicious of her. She's rather too dutiful, rather too virtuous, according to her words. We should be suspicious of her as much as everyone else. She's trying to appear rather good, isn't she? Perhaps all the characters are in disguise of some kind. It depends on whether disguises are accepted and loved by others, and not read suspiciously. Now, for a large part of the narrative, we wonder how safe Margaret would be from Henry Dunbar if she met him. Later, we wonder how safe she might be from Detective Carter of Scotland Yard. And then, how safe is Laura Dunbar from the man who claims to be her father? I think, too, that when Philip Jocelyn is introduced as a quite perfect match for Laura, perhaps we're supposed to be suspicious of that perfection. Certainly Laura herself is anxious before the wedding, reading, or rather misreading, all sorts of portents of evil. Is she going to be safe with Philip? Well, it turns out she's wrong about the signs of evil, at least from her point of view. Nothing untoward happens to her, whereas instead it does to Henry Dunbar when he's accosted by the Major at her wedding. For really, in this novel, it's less the heroines than the title character, Henry Dunbar, both characters to whom that name is given, that is in the most physical danger. Perhaps then, in this case, it's a man who plays the part of the threatened Gothic heroine. Now, Philip Jocelyn, Laura Dunbar, and Arthur Lovell comprise the most obvious triangle. But also think about other rather more significant triangle: Margaret, Clement, and her father. This latter may not be a romantic triangle, but it is a love triangle, after all, that forms the centre of the plot. A daughter's love for her father is a key part of that love triangle, and this triangle is at the core of Henry Dunbar. Then we have the misdirected letters. It depends how you define misdirected, of course. Certainly a good number of letters are read by readers they're not intended for. Joseph Wilmot intercepts the letter addressed by Mr. Balderby to Henry Dunbar, for instance, and soon afterwards we read that Wilmot reads all of Dunbar's private papers, including letters addressed to him. But then letters addressed to Wilmot by his brother Sampson are found unread by his daughter Margaret, which she finds in the old trunk, that old trope derived from Gothic. And coincidences. There are several in the novel, but apart from the physical similarities of Joseph Wilmot and Henry Dunbar, the two most important are the meeting of Sampson and Joseph Wilmot at Waterloo, a meeting that sets off the whole plot, and the encounter of Joseph Wilmot and the Major at the races, where Joseph's plot begins to unravel. Both interestingly occur at public places where large numbers of people congregate, so in realist terms, such coincidences are much more likely. The text, perhaps strangely, does seek to be realist, and I'll come on to this again a bit later. As for aristocratic villains, this is a tricky one. The villain is not, of course, Henry Dunbar or Sir Philip Jocelyn, who was a villain in the original, but the novel plays with the idea a good deal at the beginning through its inverse and through the idea of wealth. An aristocrat was and is not necessarily wealthy, but the idea of wealth was and is associated with the aristocracy. And if we accept aristocratic to mean very wealthy, then interesting games emerge. For example, at the beginning of chapter 11, when the inquest to the murder of Joseph Wilmot is taking place, there's a great play with the idea of how there's one law for the rich and another for the poor. Braddon's repeated protestations of the impossibility of a millionaire being a criminal can only be read ironically here. Just as in the opening paragraph, when we're asked to question the people's opinion of what lies beneath the bank of Dunbar and Balderby, which we'll shortly read. So here, we're asked to question the views of the jurymen who believe it unlikely that a millionaire should commit a murder. Of course, Braddon's playing with us, since Henry Dunbar, the millionaire, did not commit the murder. The rather stupid gentlemen turn out to be right, technically. They just don't know that the man who's now calling himself Henry Dunbar is actually the convict Joseph Wilmot, who's originally lower middle class and an employee of a bank. Braddon's class politics in this novel, in fact, turn out to be quite conservative, in the sense that the aristocracy is not presented as corrupt. Aristocrats are not villains. At worst, they're silly butterflies like Laura and Jocelyn, and at best, they're like Lord Herriston, thoughtful upholders of the law. Yet it's the middle classes who are most active, most acute at decoding signs, at creating signs, reading signs, and investigating signs. This skill is double-edged. It can lead to crime or to its investigation. And this stress on the middle classes rather than the aristocracy, even when the aristocracy is redefined as just wealthy. That's why, though I've just coloured aristocratic villains yellow, I haven't ticked it off. The trope of the aristocratic villain is there to be read in Henry Dunbar, and also it's not. It's no surprises that it's another game that Braddon is playing with us. So far, we seem to have rather a lot of the ingredients of the sensation fiction cake. And what about this one? Heightened suspense and detailism. Well, what does it mean for a start? Well, detailed description is an intrinsic part of realism, a mode of writing that, as you know, was dominant in prose for much of the 19th century. And there are certainly quite a lot of detailed descriptions in Henry Dunbar. Descriptions, of course, hold the plot up. They suspend the forward propulsive drive of the plot. The arrow of time is suspended when something's described, especially in 19th century realist descriptions, where the things described tend to be static, as though they were in photographs or paintings, though there are, of course, very famous exceptions. Descriptions, in other words, are a way, paradoxically, of not showing us something in sensation fiction, or rather delaying showing us what comes next. Perhaps the most striking example from Henry Dunbar is this one. Henry Dunbar and Joseph Wilmot are taking a stroll towards the village outside Winchester. The scenery is described in idyllic terms. There are wildflowers, rushes by the stream, birdsong, the sound of the wind in the leaves, and the little streams. It's quite romantic in the Wordsworthian sense. Remember Wordsworth's poem, "She dwelt among the untrodden ways beside the spring of Dove"? Or perhaps you remember "The Solitary Reaper." And then we can't see the two men anymore as they walk into a dark grove of trees. The murder happens off stage, of course, in the blank space between the chapters. When the next chapter begins, we see one of the two men return from the point of view of the harmless old verger who's enjoying the sun in the grey quadrangle of the cathedral. Now, how much of all this detail does the action require? Well, it certainly wouldn't appear in a summary of the plot. And yet it is, of course, vital. Braddon seems to be playing with us, setting up expectations in us by playing with conventions. By 1864, it was hard when reading a sensation novel to take the Wordsworthian tropes of solitude in the way Wordsworth intended. That is, associate them with spiritual insight and truth. In sensation fiction, certainly, solitude in the countryside was far more likely to be dangerous. But which archive is Braddon activating here? Which archive is the reader supposed to read this passage through? And that uncertainty is part of the pleasure of the game she's playing with us. Now, this is the very first paragraph of Henry Dunbar. Technically, I suppose, this isn't a case of heightened suspense, detail is myths exposition, but I want to point out to you right away how Braddon inveigles us into being suspicious right away. As you see, it's a very conventional description in many ways from the point of view of the people. It's a common or garden point of view. It's our point of view, the point of view that reads the street around us rather anxiously, perhaps suspiciously. The people on the street, we, are shown the dingy street and the offices. They're no great things to look at, but we know the power, the reality, lies beneath the appearance. Their vaults of gold rub shoulders with burial vaults. Capital and death bodies are separated sensationally, melodramatically, only by a very fine line, a party wall. But the contents of the vaults of Dunbar and Balderby are only popularly supposed to be enormous. No one really knows what's in them. Are we going to find out? Is the novel going to disprove what the people think and show us the reality with a privileged eye, inducting us into the mysteries of banking and what lies beneath it? Do we ever see Henry Dunbar at work? I think it's so funny later when we hear Balderby saying that he's only a sleeping partner, when in fact it's he who's at the office rather more than Henry Dunbar. In fact, we never find out what the mysteries of the bank are. Braddon is only playing with us in descriptions like these. offering us access to archives, to secret vaults and secret knowledge that she never will really give us access to. It's a red herring, a diversionary tactic that plays on news stories about corrupt bankers and bank failures. At this stage, for all we know, maybe Henry Dunbar will turn out to be a story about a bank whose vaults are empty, or one that keeps corpses in its vaults, not bank bills and railway shares, government securities and family jewels. Maybe it will be a story of aristocratic corruption and wickedness, an ingredient that turns out not to occur in Henry Dunbar, even though, as we know, that was a common ingredient in sensation cakes. And then, read this. This is the prelude to the introduction of Laura's love interest, Sir Philip Jocelyn. Do we really need to know the details of his house? All we ever hear of it later on is that there is a reception there at Laura and Philip's wedding, and that at the very end, the pair who oscillate between the rock and the abbey when they're in Warwickshire. Well, is that it? All we needed to know was that it was a grand pile, and yet Braddon chose to describe the house with a good many words. The passage on the screen is only a short part of it. It seems Braddon is setting it up as a Gothic castle in a good need of repair, in need perhaps of Laura Dunbar's money. The question is whether its owner, Sir Philip, will turn out to be a Gothic villain. Should we read this description suspiciously? Well, in the original serial version, The Outcasts, of course, he is a near bigamist with a very dark past. He's only saved from bigamy by the murder of his first wife on the night of his wedding to Laura, as I explained in the third video on Henry Dunbar, around 42 minutes in, if you're interested. In the 3-volume version, the description is only a feint. Braddon is, of course, playing with our expectations with the description. It's a Gothic cliché we know from having read so many Gothic novels. It seems to point to a brutal owner like Montoni in Anne Radcliffe's Mysteries of Udolpho of 1894. Yet in Henry Dunbar, it turns out to mean nothing other than a detailed description. Our reading suspiciously has shown us nothing. Now, there are many other elements that recur in sensation novels. There are many more ingredients that are typical. Here are just a few. I'll leave it to you to find examples in Henry Dunbar, though I doubt you can find all of them. But in any case, you will already have seen how Henry Dunbar has many of the elements of a sensation novel that I put on the screen earlier. It may stress detection and detectives, but it's unquestionably a sensation novel. What I do want to remark very briefly is how sensation novels are often set in domestic locations within a family, and you can certainly see that with Henry Dunbar. Even when families are not, strictly speaking, involved, the settings tend to remain domestic and familiar to the world of the reader, and this is something that we'll be exploring in the next video. Now, to end, I want to raise the possibility of another reframing of sensation fiction. We've already seen sensation fiction likened to an algebraic formula, a garland of the brightest flowers of literature, a domestic toy, and even a cake. We've explored it as the theft of private property, and previously as a literary form that focuses on the sensations of the reader's body at a time of rapid social and technological change. A form that has overdetermined antecedents in Gothic and in realism and many other genres, in poetry and sermons and the theatre, and many other things, including, of course, the game of reading. We've been teasing out what makes a sensation novel sensational. We haven't quite finished. There's one more video to go after this one, but I want to leave you with a question. How far do you think that this video's descriptions of the elements which go to make up sensation fiction comprise a mere formula or a genre? A tricky question, perhaps, this of terminology, and perhaps you think it's irrelevant. I don't think it is. And it won't surprise you if you followed the videos this far that I shall suggest the latter. Genre is a term that belongs, at least in theory, to the discourse of literary aesthetics. It should be a neutral term indicating only a type of literature, tragedy, comedy, epic, and so on. A type characterized by its formal elements, not only the ways aspects of the text are revealed over time, its narrative, but also the relative moral goodness of characters and to what extent they reveal reality or not. Now, there's been a good deal of debate since Aristotle's Poetics almost 2,500 years ago on whether certain genres are superior to others. Aristotle claimed tragic drama was the superior form, for example, and so you'll understand that in thinking about sensation fiction as a genre rather than as formula fiction, we're not escaping the violence that's very clear in the discourses that Mansell activates. But we can try to be conscious of it and to minimize it. If we use any of the other ways of thinking about sensation fiction we've heard about, if we activate the other discourses we've investigated and explored here, formula, garlands, toys, cakes, and so on, well, we risk dismissing such fiction out of hand. It becomes merely a domestic consumer item unworthy of our regard. Dismissing sensation fiction in this way risks the violence of regarding someone as only a wicked boy, or something or some character in a story as only an animal or objects to be murdered to allow a mystery to be solved. It's a question that Braddon debates in Henry Dunbar. Is Joseph Wilmot only a wicked murderer? Is there no other way of reading him that does not replicate the violence he himself has been involved in as both victim and perpetrator? Is there no alternative justice to the mechanics of the law? Now, you may think this question about what to call a text less important than in the treatment of living human beings, and of course it is. But the same principles apply to both. Just because we don't like somebody or something, as Mansell clearly doesn't like sensation fiction, doesn't mean we should dismiss it or treat it with disrespect. And this is an ethical question, such as we posed with our discussion of the murders in the Rue Morgue. Ethical questions like these permeate detective fiction. But if, as I suggested straight away in the first video, detective fiction is largely concerned with the act of reading, of decoding messages and signs, then the same ethical questions apply to how we read literary texts as to how we read the world around us. Ethics applies to our relations with texts, not just how texts debate the rights and wrongs of what the plot demands their ethics do. And in order to think through those ethical questions in our reading, we need access to more than one discourse, more than one archive. I hope you'll join me in the next and last video on Henry Dunbar to investigate the last two items on Mansell's list, the two very closely interrelated ideas of proximity and personality.